Greetings and welcome to our podcast, In Good Faith, a production of the UK Baha'i Office of Public Affairs, Rutland Gate, London. Joined by fellow media officer at the OPA, Carmel Kalani, I'm Nancy Warren, host for today's edition on journalism as a force for building trust and a sense of community. We're honored to have with us two experts in the field. Remona Aly, a journalist and broadcaster with a focus on faith, lifestyle, and identity. She writes for the Guardian newspaper, is a resident Pause for Thought contributor on BBC Radio 2 on the Zoe Ball Breakfast Show, and has presented BBC 4's Something Understood. Also with us, John McManus, who is currently head of media and communications for the Jesuits in Britain, a worldwide Catholic order with responsibilities for a wide range of religious programs and facilities. Before joining the Jesuits in Britain, John worked for 20 years as a reporter and producer at BBC News, specializing in religious affairs. Today, we'll begin our discussion by noting that this year, the editor-in-chief of Reuters news agency directed her annual address toward the state of journalism and the ability of every person who owns a mobile phone to become a reporter through social media and create their own channel. She asked the rhetorical question, what then distinguishes the professional journalist from the amateur, other than technology? And then answered her own query, pointing out that the difference is standards, a responsibility for gathering facts, for being objective, and telling the truth. And the news or feature article that progresses from reporter to editor to publisher to the reading audience can determine the evolution of our civilization, how cooperative or contentious, how united or disjointed. That makes the journalist a key figure in society, who as the initiator of the process is playing for very high stakes on behalf of us all. With that in mind, let's open our conversation, Remona and John, by looking back to your beginnings as professionals in the field. What can you tell us about the values and sense of public service you held going into journalism? Did you find those were challenged by a competitive industry or a professional reality? Did you have to adjust your ideal vision of the role? And if so, how did that change your worldview?
Do you want to kick off, Remona?
Hello, thanks so much for having me. Going back to the beginning, I kind of started getting into journalism actually through niche media. So I worked for a Muslim lifestyle magazine, and it came out at a time, in a very dark period, a few years after 9/11, when the spotlight was sharply on the Muslim community. So this magazine was about celebrating British Muslim life. And we were looking at, personal stories. We were gathering these, positive community stories and looking at a broad range of fields, like from finance to sport to personalities to real life stories. And so it was a beautiful way of conveying Muslims as they actually were and in their lived experiences. So it was an opportunity to kind of highlight those stories. So for me, it was really important to show what wasn't shown in the mainstream. Even though this was a niche media, we did have nationwide distribution in Tesco, etc. And I think it was a really important voice for the Muslim communities, because it wasn't something that was at all seen or recognized in the wider world. So for me, it was really, really important to bring those stories to light.
Did you see that as well as being a kind of public service in your own way, Remona, that you were carrying out a public service by focusing on those stories that perhaps you wouldn't see in the mainstream media?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It was a service to not just to the Muslim communities, but to the wider community, because, the whole point of a cohesive society is to understand each other and get to know each other. And I feel like that was my offering, my small, humble offering in a way. And it also helped me to understand the Muslim communities better too, because you get to know people so well. And a lot of people don't want to put themselves out there. And there is also a lot of mistrust as well of the bigger mainstream media outlets. So this was like a safe space for them. And we built on that, and eventually I actually left that magazine, and then I forayed into the mainstream, which was a very different kettle of fish. actually, as you well know as well.
Well, when I first started in journalism, I mean, I joined the BBC, and it was public service is very much part of the BBC's remit, so it says. And I have to say, I was quite proud to be a part of that process whereby you could do a public service by reporting on issues that affected people's lives and talking to people who were in the midst of quite life-changing stories, and especially bringing politics alive, showing how politics can affect people on the ground. And I've always really appreciated being able to do that. And something you just said really resonated with me when you said you learn things yourself. And absolutely, once you become a journalist, you start this massive learning process about what's going on in the world that never really quite stops, does it? And you're always picking up new things. And I suppose that's why we enjoy being journalists, isn't it? We really love that learning process and that accumulation of knowledge. I have to say, I wasn't always happy with things I had to do, though. I mean, most of the time, yes, I thought my employers got it right. Occasionally, just looking at the public service side of things, I would think, is that really necessary? And there's one thing that always springs to mind when I consider this issue. I don't know if you've ever had to do this, Remona, but there's something called the door knock in journalism, whereby you have to go and knock on somebody's door who's in the middle of a story, usually through no fault of their own. And I remember once there had been a murder 2 decades ago in a spot where I was working in Scotland, and new evidence had come up in the investigation. And the person who was murdered had 2 sisters, and I was dispatched to do what we call the door knock, which is where you have to go to their houses and ask them for a comment on their doorstep. And it's the most awful job in journalism ever. And I really hated having to do it, as did my cameraman. But I had to do it. And at the time, I kept thinking, what is this purpose really serving? This woman, the 2 sisters might give me a comment. More likely, as quite right, they just slammed the door in my face, and I don't blame them. And I didn't see what the public service value of having to do that was. It was purely to fill time in a news story, because we had all the facts already. We knew the investigation was being reopened. We knew what the new evidence was. We knew what had happened in the past. And that part of it, which is the kind of shock horror reaction part of news, I've always been a little bit uncomfortable with. And that's one extreme example, but there have been others.
It's really hard. I mean, I'm lucky I haven't had to do any news journalism, so it's more lifestyle based, but you do have this sense of responsibility to whoever you're interviewing, and you don't want to exploit them, you don't want to manipulate them. And often it's about selling something, isn't it, with the articles as well? So they're kind of pushing it. They're pushing, as much as you can, you need to bring as much as you can into the piece. And that can sometimes mean being insensitive to the interviewee. But for me, I really try hard to maintain that protection and that safe space for the interviewee. And even for me personally, I even say you can look over the article afterwards so that you're comfortable with it, because this is their words, this is their story going out into the mainstream, and you're just the person who's pushing it, really. So yeah, it is a responsibility, ethics of journalism, trust. I think all of these things are so important.
Yes, I absolutely agree, and it's a fine line, really, because you are doing a public service by talking about these issues and getting them into the wider mainstream. But at the heart of all these stories are human beings with feelings, and whatever they have or haven't done, or whatever their role in the story, whether they're a public official who's missed some really important part, safeguarding information, or whether they're a police officer who got something wrong, or at the end of the day, they've all got families. I always try and remember that. I always remember this person, whatever they've done, has a mother and father who is going to be really concerned about them in the same way. If I did something wrong and I was in the news, my mum would be concerned about me. And I always try and bear that in mind, and it kind of moderates my thinking and my actions, I hope. Though I'm not claiming to be perfect.
So when you go in on these kinds of stories, where you might even have a viewpoint initially, do you feel like you end up seeing all sides of the discussion, all parts in the argument, so to speak?
Well, that's what I'm trying to get to when I'm asking questions of interviewees, because I'm aware going back to what we said again about learning things, I'm aware I can't possibly know the full story. And I certainly don't know what people's feelings are, because that's personal to them. So when I go in, yes, I'm trying to structure questions and I'm trying to get the entire picture. And sometimes that picture will surprise me, or perhaps I might disagree with the picture I'm seeing, because that's possible as well, because we all have our own personal views on issues. But that's part of being a journalist. If you're going to do it properly, if you're going to do it in a way that informs the wider community or your audience, then yes, you have to simultaneously be able to hold your own biases, but also work against your own biases. You have to be able to do two at the same time. It's like having two sides of your brain where you know what you think about something, but you also know that that's not the whole story. And to be fair, you've got to get the whole story out.
Yeah. So fairness and objectivity, the professional
Absolutely.
job has to come to bear.
And I think a lot of mental energy in journalism and in newsrooms is often spent trying to make that work, because it's kind of a push me, pull me. Because journalists, by their very nature, are well informed and they have opinions on things. That's why they enjoy journalism. But at the same time, they've got to go out and admit that lots of people think differently to them on subjects, and it's their job to get that bigger story out.
That's exactly, I mean, I was thinking about this as well, how you're, for me as like a Muslim woman, like you can have this burden of representation where, you know, I have this job where I want to champion faith communities in general, as well as my own community, and highlight those stories. But also, on the other flip side of that, you also want to be critical of certain things within your community, because I'm held back, you know, as a woman within my own community. So, you know, you kind of have this space where you're talking about something very positively, but in another article, you might be criticizing something. And that can be very, very difficult when you're out there in the mainstream, because people are like, why are you, you know, throwing us under the bus? Basically. So, but you need to be honest and you need to be authentic as well as a journalist. So that's why I push out of my comfort zone a little bit, and maybe other people as well, and try to highlight things that we need to address. And also we need to be aspirational as well. We need to shift, you have to move forward. And the only way to do that is actually to highlight these issues that are sometimes uncomfortable.
Do you tend to ever find it cathartic, Remona, when you do that? Because I often have that feeling when I'm doing a story in a way you've just described, where there are different points of view in it, some of which I hold myself, and yet by being able to tell the whole story, I kind of feel I've done my bit there. I've helped get all the issues into the spotlight, and now it's up to people themselves, the public, to decide what they're going to do with that information now that I've given it to them. And I find that quite cathartic, especially on issues similar to the ones you've just mentioned, where you have a point of view and you might have issues with something that's going on, but at the same time, you're telling another point of view as well.
Yeah, and sometimes, you know, for me, for a written article, a print article, you can only convey one point because it's quite simplistic. But then I might write an article a year later that contradicts that a little bit. We have so many opinions, we have so many perspectives, and that all needs to come across. It's that Walt Whitman quote, isn't it? You know, I'm large, I have, was it many plenitudes or something, you know, in contradictions, you know, you hold many different opinions about one topic. So, for example, I wrote about the Visit My Mosque initiative in a very positive way, and 5 reasons to visit the mosque. And it was an open day that the MCB held. And then another year, I wrote about how nearly a third of mosques don't allow access to women. They can't accommodate women. And there are a variety of reasons for that. But, you know, still we need to do better, you know, as Muslim communities to accommodate the entire community. So that pushed some buttons. And sometimes it was the only article that people read. They were like, oh, you know, what are you talking about? You know, who are you to say this? But I'm like, well, my experience is I have been turned away from mosques to do my daily prayers. So I need to talk about this. We need to talk about this and move forward. So yeah, you can be a cheerleader one time, you can be a critic another. But I think that's important to have these conversations and open up these dialogues.
Looking at this, another aspect of this original idea of the editor-in-chief of Reuters, in light of the digital noise that goes on in recent years, and the role of the career journalist in contrast to that, How do you think that a discerning audience finds a reliable level of reporting? I mean, you're speaking about all different opinions that you may have, but then you're very much mitigating that with all of your principles. But I'm wondering how they find this reliable level of reporting, and especially in relation to the bias and exaggeration that often makes up the headlines. Where do you see that fitting in with your principles?
You mean, how do you get it right, Nancy? Is that the question you're asking?
Well, I'm asking how does the audience find, how does the readership find the reliable source? And how do you cope when you're trying to tell the truth and yet it's the exaggerated headline that gets so much of the notice?
I think sometimes when you come from a background that's not mainstream, it's actually easier to cut through some of the chaff in the media and see biases where some exist. So I can see from your background, Remona, you probably know how to do that. And I bet you've been able to do that from a young age. And I have as well, because my background is that I grew up in the 80s and early 90s. My parents, both Irish Roman Catholics, at a time when the IRA bombing campaign was still going on in Britain. And I remember my parents very much encouraging me to read the newspapers so I could get a rounded view of what was going on in Northern Ireland, in Britain, and what had happened historically so that we got to this point. And they encouraged me to examine what was going on in the newspapers, and then based on what I knew about history, to form my own opinion about that. And I think when you come from a background that isn't kind of mainstream, I think that becomes normal to you. You get used to looking at information and thinking, well, hang on, that's not quite right. And there's a background to this issue that you've not mentioned, which is really, really relevant. And you kind of grow up being able to do that. Also, I was lucky enough to go to a school where we had a teacher who also encouraged us to question, not to get engaged in ridiculous conspiracy theories, but to look at, for example, the ownership of the media, the messages that the media conveyed, and in whose interest they might be speaking. And very much I came out of that process. Not everybody's lucky enough to have that, though, are they? And I think many people do find it difficult. And I think sometimes when they find it difficult to decide what's for real and what is 100% fact and what's 50% fact, 50% opinion, I think that's when people start turning off the media, because they just get fed up and they can't trust it.
That's so true. I think what you're saying, John, about that asset that we have of kind of being the insider and the outsider at the same time. You can kind of have those double perspectives on things, and we look at things with more of a critical eye and try to understand the story behind it, the agenda behind it. And we see that a lot with news. It's about manufacturing certain truths, and people are sold certain versions of the truth. And often it depends on the agenda of a certain newspaper or a journalist, and you can vilify a minority community so easily. And we can see even now, how people are framed. The refugees, for example, refugees from a certain part of the world won't get the sympathy that others will from other parts of the world. So we're more attuned to kind of picking up on those hypocrisies and those contradictions. And I think it is, as you say, it's really important to have that. I mean, we're seen as having drawbacks, and it's hard to work within an atheistic framework in the media community. And you have to kind of write in a certain way, speak in a certain way, so that you're not alienating, you're not preaching. I think having those experiences, growing up as people of faith, it does help as well, even though it can be a struggle. So it's two-sided, isn't it?
Yes, but it gives you a certain amount of strength and intellectual credibility, don't you think? Because you have an ability that some of your contemporaries don't have, which is you're almost like a supercomputer, really, when it comes to news, aren't you? Because you can look at the news that's being presented to you, and you're used to looking at different perspectives. That's the key, isn't it? And perhaps that's what's missing from a lot of British society at the moment, in that people don't always have that skill. They've not been taught it, to look at lots and lots of different perspectives before forming an opinion. And also to be able to do what we've been discussing, which is to know that things are not black and white. You can hold different things in your mind, and they can all be true. Things can all you can hold two different points of view, which are both correct in your mind, because we know that human life is infinitely varied and complex, which is part of the fun of it, and that you can't just come to a straight answer on issues. It's simply impossible.
Yeah, exactly. It's not monochrome. It really is a variety of issues and colours that we need. We're lucky that we can actually recognise that as well. But it is very, very difficult to be a journalist within this noise, the digital space, where it is loud, it is crowded, and authentic news and truth gets pushed to the margins, and people have to filter all of it and try to think about it as well, have actually reflect on what they're reading and question it, and is this authentic, is this true, is there another angle to this? And I think people are getting smarter, though. I do hope that people are getting smarter. I mean, at the same time as some people kind of buying the news and just at face value, there are people who are looking to Twitter, for example, and they're not actually going to those news sources anymore because they want to know what people actually feel and actually think about a story. And in a way, even though there is crowded, we do get different perspectives through that. And sometimes news can be driven by what people are saying and what people are thinking, which is quite exciting too.
Do you feel that even beyond your need as a professional journalist to have principle and reflect that in your work, that you're also potentially serving the community interest of building bridges, building cohesion, creating a certain kind of unity, something beyond the negative to something far more positive? Oh, and if you've experienced that, what do you think you knew in particular about your audience that you were able to achieve that?
Well, for me, going back a few years, so my journalism is it's a very broad umbrella term. I've also worked with PR campaigns and kind of led those, and that has been looking at community building. Did one in 2010. I project led it, and it was called Inspired by Muhammad. It was about the universal values that the Prophet championed, and we had to enter that space where already people were thinking negatively about Islam and Muslims, and that was the concern. So we also launched a YouGov poll that looked at perceptions of Islam and Muslims, and actually it worked in our favour because it was very negative. So we're 1 in 2 Britons associate Islam with extremism and terrorism, and this is our campaign. And we did the campaign about women's rights, about caring for the environment, social justice, and it's a poster-led campaign that was put on Transport for London. So it was on the Underground, it was at bus shelters and on a fleet of taxis, and it gained an enormous amount of media interest. We weren't even expecting it. We were overwhelmed by it. In fact, it was not just national, it was global. And it showed that people are hungry for those positive news stories as well. And we were so happy about the responses to it, and that people were kind of connecting with these universal values that all of us share. So we were trying to bring people together more and think of all different faith communities as part of the wider community, not just as a minority. And then the year afterwards, I did one on Muslims and Jews, so the lost stories of solidarity between Muslims and Jews, and that was called Missing Pages. And again, that was about bringing these two great faith communities together in ways often we are seen as enemies in the public sphere. And so it was important to do that and highlight those stories, especially from World War II, about the Muslim Albanians who rescued Jews from the Nazis. And part of that was also grassroots, not just the media coverage, but also grassroots, where we got Islamic societies and Jewish societies together to co-host an American Jewish photographer who talked about documenting these stories of Albanian Muslims and Jewish families. And so they were saying this is the first time they had the opportunity to speak to each other. Media campaigns do have a reverberating effect through the different levels of society, and that is what is so exciting about journalism. It's not just words on a page. It's not just words that you hear on the radio. It actually can have an impact and start to challenge misconceptions and actually create conversation.
I remember doing a story years ago about the closure of local parish churches in somewhere in the northwest. I can't remember exactly where, but the reaction of some of the local parishioners was that they were going to meet in their own homes, and totally against Catholic doctrine, they were Catholics, were going to perform the Mass themselves and consecrate the host and wafer, which the Catholic Church teaches you have to be a priest to be able to do. However, other Catholics pointed out, isn't this how early Christians met when they first formed, or when they were just a small little kind of Jewish cult in the first century? That's how they met, in each other's homes, and carried out their religious ceremonies together. They didn't have specific buildings. And it was this really fascinating story which threw up all these historical lines like that, but was also a way of talking about how people were able to take something like a monolithic religion, or a religion that has a monolithic hierarchy, rather, and then kind of do their own thing with it. I mean, they were breaking the rules, so to speak, but they were furious about their local church closing. And so they decided, well, we are committed Catholics. We're going to carry on doing what we think is right. And I got a big buzz out of reporting that story. I didn't give my own personal view, of course, and I didn't, I got obviously some quotes from the local diocese who weren't very happy. But it was a way of, again, talking about how religion is part of people's lives in a way that's not just about, do they go to church? What do they believe in? Or do they go to the mosque? What do they believe in? But how do they live their religion normally as part of their normal lives? Right, so on Thursday, it's my turn to host this ceremony. So off I go to Asda to get some food for after the service. And then everybody's going to come round my house, and we're going to carry out this Mass service, which to me was quite amazing, having been brought up a Catholic, where Mass only ever takes place in a church building with a priest overseeing it. And for me, that was a part of showing how some communities who are under pressure, in this case, Catholics who are in some ways declining in numbers in Britain, and whose churches are closing because they're declining in numbers, were kind of fighting back. They were fighting back in their own way. They found a creative, if slightly un-Catholic, lawful way of doing it.
I like that, un-Catholic and Islamic. There are so many things that are borderline acceptable, but that's what we're here for as well, to push those boundaries sometimes, and hear how people actually live their lives as people of faith, because it's not one way. It's so varied. We're so complicated and so interesting. There isn't one way to lead a life of faith, because we're all so unique, and that's what the human journey is all about. I was also going to mention about Radio 2, the Pause for Thought strand on Radio 2 that I do. And also, like, just generally, the religion is often marginalized in the mainstream. We don't have many spaces where we can talk about it authentically. But one of the last bastions we have, I think, is the Pause for Thought strand on Radio 2, where you have a collective of different faith members, and they will speak for a couple of minutes within a flagship popular breakfast show about being a person of faith, but in a way that is relatable, and it resonates, and it's authentic, and it can be humorous. And I really love that, because you're not kind of sidelined. You're actually within that breakfast show, and you're talking about yourself authentically, rather than responding to something that's happened in the news or globally, where you're always reacting, but this is actually you on your own terms. So I think things like that, we need those platforms and those opportunities and those spaces where we can talk about our authentic lived experiences as people of faith.
I agree. I think all religions have an absolute right to participate in civil society on the same terms as any other civil society group. And I feel sometimes there's a huge blindness about the level of faith in Britain. So I've just said Catholicism is declining, and in some ways it is, but it's not, although it's declining in terms of numbers, there's still a lot of very committed Catholics out there, or who celebrate their faith in different ways. But I think even if groups are smaller in number, that doesn't mean they don't have a right to be part of society and take part in society on the same basis that any other non-religious group does. And you're right, spaces have to be found for that to happen, where issues can be raised on behalf of faiths or from a faith perspective. I don't have a problem with that. I fully believe in it, which is kind of partly why I'm now working for the Jesuits, because they take part in society. They're obviously a religious order of Catholic priests and brothers, but they also run a refugee service. They run a mission service. They're involved in schools and university chaplaincies. They've got a social justice fund. They do lots and lots of different things within society that is based off their faith and their belief in God, but sometimes they get involved in slightly political things, or they get involved in picking up the pieces where social services aren't available, or civil society can't do the whole job. And many, many faiths do that as well. And when you're doing that, absolutely, faith should be able to say, well, I'm doing this because I'm inspired by my particular religious belief. I think most people, when you put it like that, do not have an issue with that at all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A statistic that I've read recently is that approximately 20% of people in the UK espouse a particular religion, but over 60% believe in God. There's a very wide audience out there of people who do believe and who do want to hear something hopeful, which was something I wanted to ask you about, the potential for journalists to emphasize the positive and create a sense of hope. I mean, you have a responsibility, obviously, for being factual, objective, newsworthy, and all of these things. But aren't journalists in a unique position where the conversation can so often be negative or contentious to bring in this element of hope for humanity?
I have to disagree a little bit with that, actually, Nancy. I never saw that as part of my job as a journalist. I saw my job to get the facts out and then to let people make their own decisions or take action on the basis of those facts. I didn't see it was my job to build a bridge or to specifically make good things happen. But I did acknowledge that it was my job to have balanced reporting, for it not to be all bad news. And if you were reporting on an issue that, I don't know, let's say child abuse in various churches, to be absolutely factual about it, but also to point out in a balanced way that it's a tiny, tiny minority. And in fact, the numbers aren't the same as the numbers in wider society who abuse children. I believe that's correct. So I didn't see it as my point to be the bringer of good news, but just thinking about what's been going on with the reporting from Ukraine recently, where we've seen so much horror, which then sparks justified outrage, which then sparks humanitarian action and hope. I can see how one leads to the other. People are outraged about what's going on, which is why there has been such an outcry, and why the government has, I suppose, been pushed into allowing refugees to come to the country. You know, if I were out in Ukraine, I wouldn't see it as my job to make that happen, but I would recognise and acknowledge that actually, when you show people the bare horror of what's going on, most people are going to take action. They are going to be outraged, and some of them will write to their MPs, and some of them will do other things as well to try and bring some hope to the situation.
Fair enough. I mean, factual and objective, that's right at the top of the list of what the journalist needs to be doing. And I guess my question was more about the potential of what else is a possibility, what else is there. If we're doing this and it's definitely not working, is there another way? And maybe produce examples of that?
Well, for me, I'm always trying to be optimistic and give some semblance of not just hope, but just aspirations, and just challenge the apathy that a lot of people have, and just want to look at change, want to make that world better, maybe think about our own actions a little bit more. So I wrote an article about climate change a couple of years ago, or 3 years ago, and it was around Hajj could become like exceed the danger threshold in the summer, and just talking about how Muslims, we have green Islam, we have all these ecological concerns already in the Quran and in the sayings of the Prophet, but it's just about, we're not doing enough. We're not really thinking about it enough until things all go to pot and it's too late. So it was just about highlighting that issue. I'm not necessarily the person who's always practicing what I preach. You know, sometimes I might be a bit of a consumerist. I probably buy too many presents at Eid. It was just about highlighting what's going on in the community as well, and just saying how to think about this. I need to be better. I need to aspire to being greener. And in those ways, I suppose, there is a semblance of hope there, isn't there? That you want things to change and be better. So yeah, I try to put that in my articles, in my radio work as well, because people all connect with these things. We're all trying to be better. We're all trying to do something with our lives, and and I hope that kind of can universalize these issues and just create more of those strings that we can connect with each other.
Carmel, you have not said a word, and I'm very interested to know, has all this chat raised any questions for you, our conversation?
I think it's been a very interesting exploration. I think it's interesting to find this reflection of our conversation almost as what's happening in society. We want to understand the social, economic issues of our time. We want to see what are the causes of division. We don't want to be blind to them. There's this Baha'i quote that says that newspapers, at the time where newspaper was equivalent to our social media, that they're like a mirror to the world. That they're endowed with hearing and sight and speech, that this phenomenon, but that the writers have to also be free from prejudice of the ego and looking at things from the perspective of equity and justice. And I think this conversation is really reflecting that, to understand what knowledge we have to apply it constructively means seeing all elements. A mirror doesn't hide anything. Even if you push something to the front, you can always see what's behind or in the periphery. Or I think this conversation around generating feelings, authentic sort of feelings, not trying to push a story or a narrative to generate an only shock horror reactions, or just really thinking about what else can we create? What other feelings can we inspire? And when we think about this lens of human dignity that I think religion is really centered around, it's the nobility of the human being. And ultimately, this is the primary core that also unites all of the religions, seeing that humans have this immense capability to bring about unity and peace in a way that no other kingdom, animal, plant, mineral can do, only humans. And when we tell a story, we shape the world we live in. We shape what we see as possible. And it's really powerful, I think, to hear that the role of journalists in helping communities understand what is possible, what can we be engaged in our communities.
Any final comments? Anyone else?
We don't necessarily want to change people's minds completely. It's just having that opportunity to know, to engage, to recognize that there are all these different people out there, and we have different opinions and we have different lifestyles. And it's just about that communication, really. It's really important to have that communication, to open those channels up. For me, that's what I want to do in my work.
Mm. For me, it's a real privilege to meet people, especially from different faith communities, who I wouldn't know that much about in the normal course of my life, but then I get to meet them through journalism and hear about their concerns and the things that are happening with them. I really appreciate that. And I think when you show people stories about what's going on in their lives, about what's going on in other people's lives, they react to that. Most people are empathetic to a certain extent, and when you give them a story about somebody in a faith community that might touch on religion, they may not know much about the religion, but they can access what's going on in that person's lives because they're a fellow human being. And that's where doing the journalism correctly comes in, really.
That's so true about the access, but we are an access point, really, like a portal or a gateway. People can choose to enter it or not. It's up to them. The choice is there.
Thank you both so much. So many wonderful and profound things said. But that brings us to the end of our segment today, in which we hope we've demonstrated how media professionals with strong principles can forge bonds among people and within communities based on fairness and truth. We want to particularly thank our guests, Remona Aly and John McManus, for offering their wisdom and experience as food for thought. We wish them both continued success. And of course, thanks to all of you, our podcast audience. We'll be back soon with another edition of In Good Faith, so please watch for us online.